Okay, so let's get going here. It's about 9:30. So we're going to give I see some people still trickling in, so that's perfectly fine. We'll give everyone a moment to join here. We are going to be talking about pivot table reports in Workamajig here today. Uh, a tool that you can use in custom reporting here. This webinar, like most of our webinars, is scheduled for an hour. I don't know that this session in particular will take the full hour. I guess we'll see. Maybe you guys will have some questions we can dig into here. But typically how I'd run these, content up front. If you haven't been to one of our webinars here first, it's basically just me talking and you listening. So we do have the ability to take questions. If you do have a question throughout the session, feel free to pop it into the Q&A or into the chat. I try to get to each of those. I typically try to pause somewhere during the presentation if there's anything live. And of course, I always try to leave a couple of minutes towards the end if you have any outstanding questions, or if you want any more detail here. These webinars, or this webinar, like every one of our webinars, will be recorded. It will be in our help guide as well. That's a handy reference here. So again, if this is your first webinar here with us, in our support site, if you search webinar, you do have the ability to find both what our upcoming webinars are, as well as any of our previous webinars. So if I click on upcoming here, we'll let you know what's coming. We have some very exciting November webinars on billing, revenue forecasting, campaign workflow, and project schedules. Of course, you can sign up for any of these in advance. And from this page, if you look back on your 2021 or any of the previous webinars, we'll show you there's a recording for each one of these here. So if there's a particular element of the system that you're interested in, or if there's a webinar that you missed and you'd like to go back and see, they're always in here for you. And this is kind of a tremendous resource for you to be able to find those. Now, like I said, today we're going to be looking at pivot tables and custom reports. This is a relatively new feature here. I'd say it's been about a year or so since we've added these into the system here. Primarily a tool to allow you to create dynamic groups in your custom reports without having to use calculated columns. So it would be a little bit more of a step past kind of an entry level to custom reporting. Although if you haven't really gotten into that, that's fine. Here, we're going to be kind of addressing how you build custom reports, at least at a surface level here. Of course, again, I will be trying to answer any of the questions that you guys have. So if you want any more detail on a piece or something to that effect, don't be shy. Feel free to ask those questions in the chat and we'll try to get to those. But of course, you're always welcome to follow up with your Workamajig account manager as well. If you want a deeper dive on this or any specific questions to your process in particular, specifically if there's a report that you're working with in general, it's a little bit difficult to troubleshoot those on a webinar here. So if you do need to reach out to your account manager, reach out to us here for support on any particular report that you're having an issue with or anything related to this. Or anything else Workamajig related for that matter, you can always reach us here at support@workamajig.com. So let's jump in here. Again, just defining what pivot tables are here in Workamajig. I'm sure you're probably familiar with how they work in Excel. It's kind of a similar idea here in Workamajig. It's really the ability to create dynamic groups. Workamajig custom reports do allow you to create calculated columns. But this kind of gives you the ability to create that grouping and take the same data and visualize it in a couple of different ways, depending on what you're looking for. So that pivot table functionality has basically been built into the system on any of our custom reports. Now, this can only be used with custom report data sets. So if you've ever taken a peek at the help guide article for it, or if you've never really seen the option to pivot in a report, then that's probably because you're looking in the wrong place there or isn't supported on that particular report type, namely no standard reports and no views. And what I mean by that is your views, you'll see them on any today page here in Workamajig. So if I jump to today project manager or today billing, really doesn't matter. You'll always see an area here for views. And from a reporting standpoint here in Workamajig, when we're speaking about views, views always means a report type where it is one line per whatever data type for that view. So if I'm looking at views projects, for example, that means that whatever I see in here is always going to be a single line per project, and I can build multiple reports based off of that information. Typically, when I'm training my clients on how to use custom reporting here at Workamajig, this is really where I've started. So if you, or where I would have them start. So if you're kind of new to Workamajig or you're new to report building in Workamajig, the views are a really, really great way to know that you're starting with the correct data set, right? I want something that tells me where my reports or my client invoices are. I know that the report will give me one line per that data type. And so you can kind of create and copy views from there. So this is always a good intro to their custom reporting system here in Workamajig, but we don't support pivot tables in these views. It does have to be out of a custom report built in the back end of the system, and I'll show you where those are here in a moment. I also mentioned standard reports. Standard reports would encompass anything that's any kind of canned report or anything that came with the system here when you initially got Workamajig. They will actually still be in the system. There's just a number of reports that we bake into them. Some of them are very standard reports you'll see in most accounting systems, your client and project P&Ls, your corporate P&Ls, AR and AP aging, things like that. Those are all standard reports. We don't really have the ability to pivot those reports either. So, just for example, in your project financial reports, we have the project budget analysis here. This is a great report. If it's not something that you use, I highly recommend taking a peek at it. It's really great. But unfortunately, we can't pivot out of this report as a standard report. There's good reason for that. Most of these have custom coding applied to them, but just note that if we're looking at pivot tables, it's going to have to be a custom report that you've built in the report center here in Workamajig. If you're not familiar, the Report Center is located from the main menu underneath the Everyone application here in the Report Center. And custom reports would refer to anything that was built on a data set that you have access to. So if I come to this custom report page, of course, all of those standard reports are here. If I click the new custom report button, we can see kind of gives us the ability to build a report from the ground up. So, I was mentioning a moment ago, views is oftentimes where I would start users kind of new to our reporting engine here in Workamajig. And part of the reason for that is you can simply copy an existing view and then tinker it to where you want it to be. It kind of gives you a basis to start with. But if we're adding a custom report here in the back end of the system, in this reporting area here of Workamajig, we're starting with the data set, and it is going to be a complete blank report. Typically allows you to build it from the ground up. And for these, I always try to tell, again, if you're new to this functionality or to custom report building here in Workamajig, one of the things I typically tell my clients when I'm training them here on how these work is to look at what there is one row per in the data set. So if I'm looking at company level data, for example, the brief description down here will tell me what I'm getting in that view. And then typically we'll let you know, hey, there's one row per company, or there's one row per opportunity, for example, or there's one row per spec sheet. That really helps to figure out kind of raw data that you're working with. And that data then can be rolled up or grouped into whatever you need. So for the custom reporting engine itself, we're starting with raw data. The most common, I would say, that are used here would typically be time detail or transaction reports. Those really start at a raw data level, allowing you to say, hey, give me something that gives me one line per every time entry that's entered into the system. And oftentimes, because it is so much raw data, that's going to be something you're going to want to take and group. So I've built a couple of these custom reports here. What you have as an option to add, again, if you're new to this, is going to be based off of your security rights. If you are an admin in Workamajig, each security group that you have, you can give access to or remove access to any specific data set in here. Whatever you see, I can say, you know what, this group should have access to activity link data or time detail data or whatever the report site is, and this one shouldn't. So again, if you don't see something in here that you'd like, hey, I need to use time detail data, I need to be able to build invoicing or billing reports, either you as an admin need to adjust the security group, or you need to reach out to an admin to tell them, hey, I need access to this report type here. Now, for the pivot tables themselves, they would be after you've created one of these reports. And I created a couple in advance of this call, just a couple of common report types that I get requests for, I see clients build quite often here. One based off of time detailed data and one based off of client billings per month. This is actually a downloadable report that we have. I'll show you where that is in a moment, and I'll let you know how you can download that towards the end of the call here. But again, you can build these from scratch on those data sets. This first one here is built on time detailed data. I would say that this is far and away probably the most popular custom report data set that we have in Workamajig. Again, it really starts you with raw information and allows you to group, filter, and sort that information however you'd like. And I have another one built on I believe it's on client billing. Actually, I'd have to look. Yeah, I believe it's on the client invoice level data is what the other one is. And again, this is just looking at what client invoices were created in the system, and it's one line per invoice on this one. So they're both relatively easy to understand here. The question is how the pivot tables will help us in dealing with the information that we have here. Now, this is my test site, so time entry is intermittent on this site. Hopefully, your teams are a little bit better about entering time than my fictional agency here. But in our time detail data report here, if we look at it, we jump into the edit section, I built something relatively simple. I've grouped the detail of the time entries by month, and I'm outputting some columns around some detail of those time entries. Who's the user, which client, which service, how many hours, and then I have a few other fields we'll get into here in a moment, but it's relatively simple, right? Just kind of returning per month how many hours that we have. In our custom report set here, if I search this, it's going to group it exactly how I asked. What's the month here? Who's the user? And then I can take this information and kind of work with it, adjust it how I want in the standard report view. And you'll notice after I pull a search on this, we also have the ability to pivot this information. Now, prior to actually going to the pivot table, you're typically going to want to work in the edit section. Actually, not only typically, you're going to be required to jump in here to define how you want to pivot the detail. So when you're putting something together here, typically you're not necessarily putting together a report in Workamajig with the express intention of pivoting the data. I mean, maybe you are, but what we're starting with here at the beginning is basically what information do I need in this report? So I basically built a standard report that gives me something relatively useful, right? Per month, how much time was entered into the system to what services. And again, I can kind of look at these in groupings and see, oh, okay, in April, we had 263 hours worked, for example, and I can look at the fields that were entered into here and also return some calculations in these. So this is useful, but one of the challenges for this standard, I should probably order these properly too, but one of the challenges for the standard views here in Workamajig is that this isn't terribly flexible. Oftentimes what we found users were doing was building multiple reports. So maybe I also want a weekly time detail report, for example, or maybe I want a time detail report that rolls up per client. And I could do some of that here too by adding, client name as a grouping, for example, that gives me some additional pieces in here. But pivot tables really allow you to be way more flexible with how you want to look at the information. So essentially what you can do is build, like I did here, kind of a standard functional report that gives you something useful, but also allows you to pivot that information and get it in a couple of different ways without fundamentally changing the report itself or having to create an identical report to it. So what I've done for the pivot table for this here to start is a couple of relatively easy things. And, let's just go ahead and take a look at it here for now. This one is returning by username. And again, forgive some of the goofy Star Wars characters or Office characters in here. This is my test site that I'm using to display this information. And then by month here. And again, I probably want to adjust the sorting to make this run sequentially, which is entirely possible. But either way, you can kind of see the pivot table gives us a different way of looking at this. So instead of looking directly at the month, the pivot table is looking per user, how much time was entered in those specific months. So if I jump into the edit section of the report here, we can see how the pivot table has been built in itself. And again, typically you would want to run through the process of building a standard report here with your layout and your filters. And then from there, you can jump over to the pivot side where you determine how you want to cut this information out. So I'm going to go ahead and remove some of these here. We'll kind of add them in just a moment here. But really, we're working with anything that's on the report itself already is going to be in the pivot table field list. Of course, it has to be something you're already pulling into the report. That's also why you typically wouldn't see the option to pivot until you pulled the standard report first, or using the standard report detail to actually pivot the information here in this report. So the rows, of course, are going to be what you see on the far left-hand side, what we're totaling up. So if I'm looking at the actual pivot itself, the rows are my username, right? All of this that's seen here, come on now, there we go, on the left-hand side. Our columns are, of course, these pieces here up at the top. So the pivot allows you to come in here and say, you know what, I want my rows to be by the username. I want my columns to define how much time those users have worked per month. And I want the actual value to be the sum of the actual hours they've worked in that period. So again, still working with the raw data. I may have someone who made, over 100 standard entries in that month-long period, but we're summing it all up for the purposes of this pivot table. So really starting from the ground of, a bunch of raw data here, and then turning that into something that we can sum into the fields. Now, you do have filters at this level, but this is one of the things I really want to impress on here. Typically, you don't want to use the filters at this level. They do work. You can actually apply filters at the pivot level or at the pivot level, but typically it's best served just to filter it on the report side itself first. So for example, if I only wanted this particular report to look at a single year, I would probably create a filter here, for, date worked between that year, right? So they'd say, oh, the date work has to be from 2021, just as an example. And I could come in here and I could set that. I'd probably want 1231, right? And so you could kind of filter it prior to the point that it hits the pivot table. To me, it's much, much easier to do that here or to set prompted filter conditions so you can enter stuff like this in yourself. You could just say, what date worked between, and then whatever I actually search on the report, when I enter that and filter in here will also be considered from the pivot side. So it always starts with, hey, what am I pulling into the report here based off of how you have your groups and your columns set up? And what am I filtering that information to, right? Am I looking at a specific client? Am I looking at a specific date range? Whatever filters that you'd like to apply, they're typically best served here. To me, it's very confusing to have filters both at the general report level and then try to filter further down on a pivot table. Again, it's entirely possible, but most of the time I try to tell all my clients, don't use this filter. Use the filter that's in the report set itself, just easier to work with that way. So from here, I've built something relatively easy, right? We can see everything that's actually in the fields list here, and we can basically just click and drag these down to the rows or columns where we want them. This one's pretty easy. It's just saying per user, and for the date work month, there is actually in this date work month formatted too, which numbers them so it puts them in the correct order. That is absolutely what I should have used here, but since I didn't, it's just alphabetizing our months for us. But either way, right, my rows are the user, my columns are the date work for the month, and my values are the sum of the actual hours worked. And again, prior to actually running the report, if I come into this fresh, Workamajig will not just show you a pivot option. We need to run the report with the filters that you'd like first. And then once you do, you get that option to change between the grid or the pivot views. Now, the pivot side will always remember how you've had this set up. Oh, I may have to pull those out again. Oh, no, I don't. Okay, perfect. So, when I come into here, I don't have to change this each time, but it is pretty easy to do. I can come in here and change this whenever I'd like and click apply changes here. For my pivot view, again, it's grouping per user and month, what we have here. And once you have data in the pivot table views itself, there are a few options within this tool here to be able to change the way that this is displayed. By default, you're always going to end up in a grid view like we see here. But you do have the option to change the output for these to bar or line or area or scatter. There's quite a few options in here. For example, jump this into column. Depending on how you're looking at this, obviously there's, some views are going to be better served than others. I can pull this into a bar, into a line. These themselves are printable typically. You have the ability to print these out into a PDF or Excel. You'll see this option right here, right? This one, PNG, JPEG, or SVG. So you can print the data visualization here as well. And this first option with these columns here are really where it allows you to change that, right? So we can look at a few pieces here for scatter or line or column. There's quite a few. There's actually a more option in here as well that allows you to kind of get even deeper into this. So there's quite a bit that you can work with here. The pie chart, for example. All of these work. They'll all give you data visualization pieces here that you can then also print out of the system using this option here on the left-hand side. There's a few other options in this here too. One of the things I would kind of warn you about to some extent with this tool here is sometimes it's a little bit challenging to get back to your actual grid detail when you've done this. So you can simply just close the report and rerun it again to get back to that initial piece that you were at there, right? So it gets me always going to start here first with the grid-based views. Just know that you have a lot of options for how you want to parse or display this information once you do that. Of course, we want to make sure the data looks correct and we have it formatted correctly here first. And then from there, I can kind of decide how I want to, how do I want to visualize this if I choose to do so. Last two options here on the right-hand side are really just whether or not you're showing the grand total here, because this is a subtotal. This is not necessarily a field that we contain in the standard grid view here. It's just, of course, grand totaling everything from left to right. How many hours did Candace enter across the entire time period that we're looking at here? Just as an example, and then per month, and then the subtotals, right? Subtotals per month. So both of these Do I want to show grand totals? Do I only want to see them in the rows or the columns? And then do I want to see also the subtotals in here? Now, this report in particular has been built. There's not a ton to it, but again, one of the points here to a pivot table is that I can either add detail or kind of change things around as I'm working through this. So if I jump back into the edit section, I don't necessarily have to have this set up the way I do, where I have only a single row and a column. The order that you have this information will determine how it's displayed in the tool itself. So for example, I can jump in here, again, using any of the fields I had selected previously, and I can say, you know what, my rows are username, but I also want to break that out additionally by client, just as an example, right? How much by user and client, and then for date, work, month, or you know what, I can put client, let's put client in a column. We'll say date, work, month per client. And also I want to know by user and then also service how many hours were entered in a monthly or grand total period for them. So you can add some additional detail here. I can go ahead and again apply those changes. And then when I look at the report, it looks pretty similar, but the difference is that we've added an additional breakout that we can expand to. So if I look at my entries here, since I added user and service, if I click the drop down arrow, my goodness, I've entered a time to a bunch of different services here. We can see, you know, for me in a specific month, how much time was entered in total. So 171 hours here in April, and then how much time was entered per a specific service. So you can kind of pivot it to add additional breakout details in here. Same thing on the column side, since I added the ability to see per month and column, we can also add that detail in here, right? For April, these were the clients that we entered time to, and then the subtotal would actually be visible at the bottom of this report for each client. So you have the ability to really add a lot of information in here. Obviously, at a certain point, there's some diminishing returns here. You don't want to go too crazy with how much you're parsing this data. The pivot table will attempt to add that for you here, but you know, at a certain point, you may want to look to just kind of adjusting it. Not going too many levels deep here, otherwise it might be difficult to read. And one of the things I did want to point out here too at this point with our pivot tables is if I print this to Excel, we typically are only printing the top level grid detail. So even though in system I've added something here like what the breakout is per service, I don't believe the Excel printed report version for this works that way currently. I believe it only prints the top level like this. Have to double check, but that was true as of not too long ago here. So again, it's just something to consider if this is something you want to print a physical copy or if you want to create a digital copy. It's typically going to only have the top level information in here for you. All right. All right. So I have a couple of questions here. Regarding, can you save a pivot table to use as a specific chart type visualization when it's run? No, actually right now, what it does here is it always remembers the grid view first here, and then you can come in and parse the data to whatever visualization type you'd like from there, but it's always going to start with this view here first. And then I have another question here regarding, can you create a dashboard to see a number of custom reports in one view? Kind of like a mission control center of key reporting metrics. You can, that's probably going to be something less on the pivot table side here. This would be more for general reporting needs here. What you're looking for is probably more under any of the PM dashboard or graphs pages. The graphs are a way to visualize data here in Workamajig as well, and you can create a bunch of these on the same page here if you'd like. So this would probably be an easier way to do that. This tool is a little bit less powerful in terms of how much you can do with it versus what you can do in our standard reporting engine. You're typically only comparing 2 to 3 different pieces of information on these tools, but this is a way to visualize data here in the system. For example, I have a few in here, year to date hours by service. Just as an example, you can build grids like these here, and that would kind of be the separate training here. We do actually have a couple of webinars for this. So if you're interested in this tool and you're not really familiar with it, I would definitely refer you to those. But for the tool that we're looking at here today for the pivot tables, this is really for, this is honestly a bit more flexible in the information that you can use. And it's not necessarily meant to be a data visualization tool by default. It's really meant to have that as a functionality or as a function of creating kind of your own dynamic groups within existing reports, rather than kind of a simple of how many hours have, a person entered, to this point this year, for example. Okay, so I mentioned that there was 2 of these here. For this one, I don't know that there's too much more to show. Again, just wanted to impress a couple of things that, you can take your existing detail that you have here on the report. You can pivot it out into specific columns or rows. You can obviously get really creative with this. So there's probably some use cases or functionality for it that you may think of that I'm not showing here. But this is the gist of it, right? What rows and columns do I want? What values do I want displayed in those rows and columns? And let's go from there. Now, another note or two here before I move on to the client invoice side of the billings here. You can still use calculated columns here in these reports, and you can also use those calculated columns in your pivot tables as well. I added a really simple one in here. I actually think this might be a field already in the time detail data report, but I created one for remaining hours that takes the actual hours worked minus the allocated hours. Again, these are all perfectly fine so long as we have that detail or that field pulled up here in the report itself. It will be available in the pivot table. We just always name, we do actually name them for what they were. Now, they used to be called calc column 1 or something like that. Now we name them here. So, my remaining hours field is one that I made that's custom to this report. That's a calculated column report. Okay, yeah, so let's go ahead and I have a question here of how you remove a column, row, or value from a pivot table. You can actually click and just drag them back out. So I added in service description, for example. You can just grab it here. It's these bubbles here you see on the left-hand side. Let me zoom a little bit. There we go. These bubbles you see on the left-hand side, as soon as you hover over those, you'll see the ability to drag these out. And you can just drag it back to the top to remove them from this list here. Additionally, there's a few other options on these. You can sort these here. You can also filter these a bit. Again, I would recommend doing this at the report level. And when you're looking at the value side of a pivot table, you do have the ability to change how you're getting this information. Because if you remember, if I look at the report itself, it's pulling in every hour entered here. So it's pulling in each time someone's made an entry on a timesheet, and it's grouping all of that information together. When I'm on a pivot table, it's just saying, hey, I found for Daniel all of these hours together. Let's add them up per the month. The tool here itself, when we're looking at the pivot table, you can tell the system how you want these to work. So it did assume that I wanted to sum them, which is exactly what I wanted, but you can count the distinct number of lines. You can say the minimum or maximum. There's a number of different ways you can represent the values in here as well. And that would be through the drop down that you see here. There's another question here. Is there an end of month date function so that monthly columns would sort by date and show month name and wouldn't necessarily show year, and it's going to depend on the data set that you're working with. This data set in particular, time detailed data, if I look at the fields available for it and I just type in month, there is the date work month field, which is the one I'm using. Honestly, I probably should have used date work month formatted, which is both. There is also month year worked. That must be relatively new here as well. We're always adding fields to these. So date work month formatted will give you something like this. It will start with 04 April. That would actually have given me a better layout on my pivot table view. If you look at it right now, it's alphabetical, right? So it's starting with April, which is really not terribly useful for us. But what I could do here is replace my date work month field with date work month formatted. And that would get me a little bit more of a, it's going to start with January. So we have the option for both in there. I actually have not played with the date, the month and year. That would be what it was a month and year worked. Okay, so yeah, I'm assuming this works exactly how you think it was, like April 2020, for example. But let's take a peek. Yeah, so there is actually something like that in this report. And again, it is going to depend on which data set that you're working with, whether or not these fields are available. This is a very, very common data set, the time detailed data set. But yeah, so these ones will show you specifically, this was 2019, April 4th. And yeah, that's going to definitely would probably give me the most detail out of my pivot view. Probably a little bit more useful to know which year it was worked in rather than how much time was entered in each April ever in our pivot table views. But again, you do have the ability to filter these, right? So to me, the use case here would be, hey, I'm looking for 2020 hours, right? I would enter in the date worked between there, and then I would pivot it using my date work month formatted field. But both of those are available here. But anything you use in a pivot table is going to have to be an existing column in the data sets that you're working with. So hopefully that helps. I'm glad you asked that question, actually, because I didn't even know that we had this field available. This is relatively new. It's exciting. So glad to use this. These are the sort of things we would often build calculated columns for. And so, a direct use case for how a pivot table would work, right? The field is already existing in here. Let's go ahead and pivot that detail over there. Now, the other example report that we have in here, and this one is actually downloadable. It's in our help guide. So if you look at the pivot table report support article here in our support site, I'll actually put this in the chat. So if you want to grab this and take a look at the article, this is, kind of a summary, obviously, of how the tool works, how to work with it itself. But one of the reasons I want to link to it here, aside from the fact that it is a nice reference guide for if you're starting to work with these here, at the bottom of this, you actually have the ability to download an example file that has kind of a setup for the pivot table already. I actually downloaded this and imported it into my system yesterday. It's actually this report that you see here, the client billings by month pivot. That's what it will be named here. But basically, to import this report, you would download it here, right? So you'd click the example file, and then you can import it as a view in Workamajig. That's actually relatively easy if you have the access rights to do that. You can import records here through the import data area here in Workamajig. The type of file import would be view, and all you need to do here is say, this is a view, select the file that you downloaded from our help guide, display and import it. You really don't need to change it all. You just click display and then import. And once you do, the system will import that report here into the report center for you. It would be under your other reports by default. But that report here is client billings by month. This is a very similar report to the first one that we were taking a look at. It's basically looking at one line per client invoice here, and it's pivoting that data into a timetable. So if we look at the edit section of this report here, it's just saying, hey, when was this invoice created? Who's the client? What's the invoice number, the amount billed, and the project name? So it gives us some information to work with from a pivot perspective. And again, if I pull it, it does give me some useful data here. I could, again, take the same information and group it and create some information in the standard view here. But once I have that information over here, I can also pivot it to look at, for example, per client, how much I've billed per month. A relatively easy report to put together. From a custom perspective, again, it is also available as a downloadable piece here. And this is essentially how it would work. So again, in the edit side of the system, if we look at the pivot table, all we're doing is saying my rows are for the client, my columns are for the invoice month, and what I want to know is the sum of the amount billed per all of those invoices in those monthly blocks. So this one actually doesn't have the pivot table option set up. When you download or if you import the report, it's going to be blank just like this. So I actually think that's kind of a good thing because it kind of starts you with how you would work with the report itself and how you'd create the pivot tables. You'd basically come in here and say, oh, I want to know per client, so that's going to be my rows per month, how much we've billed for each one of these invoices. And then I could do things like, hey, you know what, for the client and project, again, same idea as what we saw previously, and the invoice month and maybe the invoice number. I don't know, that might be a bit much. Let's just go with client and project here for now. But again, same thing. If I apply changes, I search, and I look at the pivot table, it just gives me an additional breakout. So I can see, okay, you know what, for it looks like most of my invoicing was done here in March this year. But for, this client, Acme Limited, I could pop this open and it would even show me per project how much we've invoiced in those months as well. So just kind of gives you the ability to add some additional detail to these without having to use complicated custom calculated columns or having to build multiple reports out of the data set for these. So yeah, I have a question here. Are templates that you could leverage for report imports? That's actually something we're just starting to look at doing right now. Like I said, this is really the first one that we've got here. I spoke with our account manager that actually manages our support site here. This is one of the things that we discussed is kind of building a few standard pivot table reports. Right now, one of the things that we've noticed is when we make these downloadable reports here, the pivot table details don't remain in here. So you would still have to manually enter this information in for now. I don't know if it's going to remain that way in the future, but at least for now, we would give you kind of the structure and then you'd have to decide how you'd want to pivot it. But again, honestly, this tool, like a lot of things here in Workamajig, to me, the best way to get familiar with them is just to get in and start playing with them. You're really not going to hurt anything. You always have the ability to change and apply these changes. And with a custom report, again, if you're not familiar, a custom report is not permanently changed after you edit it until you click the memorize button. So for pivot reports or pivot tables, just like your standard grid reports, you can make a change and go, oh no, I don't like that at all. Close the report and without saving, and then just reopen it to kind of start again. But for now, right now, it's just the one. I anticipate that we are going to have some additional example files. They're probably going to be added to this report here itself, unless I can't think we would want them somewhere else. But for now, we just have the one for client billings by month. It at least gets you started with a few fields in there that you can then pivot and kind of visualize it in whatever way you want. And again, this one actually in particular, I think makes a lot more sense from the data visualization standpoint. Looking at the raw numbers is great, but, coming in here and saying, okay, I want to look at a bar graph, for example, on these is pretty helpful, and you can expand these bar graphs once you have them in here. So I can hover over any of these. This report in particular, I think, is a lot more useful, a lot more helpful from a data visualization standpoint. So yeah, hopefully we'll have some new standard reports for you to download here soon. Another question here, what data set would you use for a report on revenues by month? I think that this is partly the same thing. This is client invoices, so this would really just be what you've created as a client invoice. If I'm looking at revenues, I'd probably look at client receipts. I believe that's exactly what the data set would be called, client receipt level data. So this is actually the same as what you get in the views area. So if you're on billing today and you look under views receipts, those are the actual payments by your clients to you. That's probably what I would use for revenues by month. This does have the ability to look at the data, the transaction, and group them by month as well. Okay, so to me, this is one of those tools. I think it's very helpful to see a couple of examples up front. Of course, you can pivot pretty much any custom view that you create. So you can create projects reports, you can create reports with lines on your estimates or opportunities. Those can all be pivoted out here as well. I chose these two because these are the most common types that I get from requests from my clients or from other clients when we're working with customer reports. So more than happy to, to start with these. But again, these are very flexible. Anything that you can create as a custom report here in Workamajig from a contact management or sales side, from a project or invoicing side, any of those, all of these that you can create in here as custom reports can be created into pivot tables. And again, we're always here willing to help. So if you get stuck with something, or if you're looking specifically, at a report type that you would like, or you'd like to be able to pivot here, again, don't hesitate to reach out to us at support@workamajig.com. Oftentimes, I think the hardest time in building, or the biggest challenge in building a custom report is kind of figuring out where to start. What data set do I need? What has the information that I'm actually looking for? Once you have that, it tends to be relatively easy to put those together. So for any of those reasons, right? I often tell my clients, hey, if you want to start building these yourself, I would definitely encourage that, because that's really how you're going to get comfortable with this reporting engine. And it is very powerful. There's a lot that you can do with it. But because of that, there's a bit of a learning curve. And so it's best to just kind of get in here and start playing around with them. But I always tell my clients, hey, if you want to know which data set to start with, or if you've started a report and you're stuck on it, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to answer those questions, and I'm sure the rest of the account managers are here as well. So if you start working with something and you have a question, don't hesitate to reach out to us. But for this webinar here, that I think is really the long and short of working with the pivot tables here. Just a couple of notes on the tool itself. I mentioned this, but I think it probably bears repeating, is that your mileage will vary kind of on some of the sub options that you have in the reports themselves. Sometimes the report can be unresponsive. Again, if you're drilling down into looking at the pivot tables and you're visualizing the data, specifically these here, if you have a ton of subgroupings and categories, it can make these a little bit unmanageable. Again, just kind of manage your expectations around how much you're asking from one single pivot report here. Again, if I pull a scatter graph and I just have a ton of subgroupings underneath the users, for example, I pivot this out 4 or 5 times. I have seen a couple times where it's basically unreadable. So just manage your expectations a bit on how much you can get there, but feel free to push it as well. And I mentioned this as well earlier, that your filters are always better served filtering here first. Filter the raw data that you pull in first. Don't use the filters option in here. Whenever I build a pivot table for a client, I never use this option again. I just haven't really found a good reason to have a secondary filter, and I just think it's more confusing that way. So I would just kind of apply those two warnings here. But that's basically what I have for you. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to pop them in. I'll hang out here for another couple of minutes. If you guys have anything specific that you want to take a look at here. Oh, looks like we do one here. Will I pull up the credit card charge report? Well, I could pull one up here, but I would actually have to be kind of a from scratch. So you can kind of do the same things here when we're looking at the credit card charges. I'm assuming you mean when we're looking at a custom report, credit card charge application data, credit card charges. Again, so kind of some details around here. What I think you'd probably be asking for in this would be the 1 row per credit card entry. And you would have to kind of build these from the ground up, the same as I did the other one. So I did some of the advanced work here first, but whenever you build a custom report in Workamajig, it's going to start like this, just completely bare to have you build from the ground up. So then from here, I'd basically decide, okay, what do I want? What data do I want in my pivot table? I always start with building kind of a functional report first. So does this one have a month? Oh, it doesn't. I would have to build that in specifically, but we'd probably want charge by. The charge amount would be one here, right? We'd want the charge date or the posting date, one of those two, kind of enter those into the system here. And again, you can create calculated columns at this point that you pull into a pivot table, but the idea would be basically that you would start with this here. You kind of start with the information that you need. In the drop downs here, it will show you every field that's available. Typically what I like to do is just start typing in the text for what I'm looking for. So if I'm looking for a date, for example, I could type that in here and it would show me every field that matches that text that I've entered in here. And then once you start to build these, you can kind of take it and then pivot the information from there. This one doesn't have a month filter, so we'd probably end up having to build one, but again, that's all perfectly fine. We could do those things. Any other questions on pivot tables or custom reporting in general? Anything you guys have on your mind here? Okay, perfect. So appreciate you guys all coming here to this webinar. Again, if you have additional questions or if you'd like to kind of touch base specifically with your account manager, I would definitely encourage you to do that. You can reach out to them at support@workamajig.com. Typically for webinars, you can also follow up with your account manager as well. They would typically know your process better than we would. They'd be familiar with, how you deployed and what your day-to-day looks like. So if you have any specific questions from them or for them, I would encourage you to reach out. And occasionally we'll also schedule, direct trainings. That way it's not just me talking at you. You can actually ask questions directly to your account manager who'd be more familiar with your processes. And I would encourage you to do that if you'd like some more information. But again, thank you all for joining me here today. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.